Hi, I'm James Verdier, and welcome to the American Institute of Biological Sciences Bioscience Talks, which is a forum for integrating the life sciences. Before we get started today, I wanted to give a very quick pitch for our online Writing for Impact and Influence science writing course at AIBS, which is taught by yours truly and starting this July 9th. The basic idea behind the course is to help scientists improve their outreach and professional writing with a real focus on preparing publication-ready work for broad audiences. Of course, we'll also touch on technologies like generative AI and all that good stuff, and how not to use those technologies. There's a link in the show notes for more information, but feel free to send me any questions about the course at bioscience@aibs.org. But now for today's episode, I'm joined by Dr. Patt Finnerty, a postdoctoral research fellow in the Global Ecology Lab at the University of Sydney. He was here to talk about his recent bioscience article, Urban Rewilding to Combat Global Biodiversity Decline, a link to which you'll of course find in the show notes. And with no further ado, let's go to the interview. Thank you very much for joining me today.
Yes, thanks, James. Great to be here and really excited to chat with you.
Thank you. I've been really looking forward to this for a little while. So I was hoping we could get started with a little bit of an introduction to the general concept of rewilding as a conservation strategy. Could you just tell us a little bit about what that's all about in a very broad sense?
Yeah, for sure. So rewilding was a term that was actually coined not too long ago in the early 1990s in the United States, actually. And it was more focused on the conservation of what they call the 3 Cs: cause, carnivores, and corridors. And pretty much it's just the thinking of reintroducing at the start of its level of rewilding was the reintroduction of keystone predators into ecosystems, whether that be large apex predators or herbivores, to kind of take on these roles that have become absent through, animals becoming extinct or being pushed out of areas, to kind of improve the health of an ecosystem or bring it back to what it used to be through, whether that be the control of overabundant populations of prey, or, the control of large areas of vegetation where herbivores have been absent for certain amounts of time.
And just, thinking about this from an unfortunately U.S.-centric point of view, but it's the example that, I'm most familiar with, and I'm going to bet that a lot of our audiences too. Would this be something like putting wolves back into Yellowstone?
Yeah, so that's the example that's pretty much most well known when you talk to someone about rewilding. They pretty much straight away go to the wolves and Yellowstone example, and it's a fantastic example of the success of a rewilding story. But since we've seen kind of rewilding as a term in the last decade at least kind of pivot to a number of different definitions, that kind of rewilding is trophic rewilding, where you bring back a wolf, for example, an apex predator back into an ecosystem. But since we've seen a kind of shift into multiple definitions, plasticine rewilding, for example, is trying to bring back species assemblages or similar species assemblages based on an evolutionary perspective, bringing animals back into ecosystems where they were based in the late Plasticine. Or a different kind of definition of rewilding here is surrogate rewilding, and this is bringing back species into ecosystems to fill an absent niche, not the actual species that went extinct, but a surrogate species that can kind of uphold that ecosystem function or that fill that niche that the extinct animal once had, to improve ecosystem function more broadly. But since, again, the wolf example, we've narrowed down even further. In Australia, in particular, we talk about safe haven rewilding, and this is the reintroduction of species back into ecosystems, usually behind a fence where threats have been removed, whether that's invasive predators. In Australia, we have really big problems with foxes and cats. So bringing species back into like controlled fence reserves is being coined safe haven rewilding. And on top of that, again, and this is more popular in the more Europe sphere of rewilding, is more passive rewilding. And that's not the active reintroduction of species back into ecosystems, rather letting species come back on their own into ecosystems, whether that's, agricultural land or areas that have been abandoned. And we're seeing that gain more and more popularity, especially in the UK.
And so, in the passive rewilding sense, it's just sort of stop the active extirpation of a species, allow the habitat to become more favorable to them, and then they just show up again because there's some connectivity.
Exactly. Simple as that. If the ecosystem's improving on its own, and it's just the natural, reintegration of species back where they should be.
And today we'll specifically be talking, though, about urban rewilding. So can you just kind of introduce us to that topic and tell us a little bit about how that sort of approach works?
Yeah, for sure. So urban environments in particular have been, more and more focused on because we've recognized urban areas to be one of the an area that have undergone rapid decline in ecosystem health, or our biodiversity losses in urban environments are greater than they are anywhere else in the world, purely because of our human footprint spreading and resulting in the loss of species. So this thinking of urban rewilding is the active reintroduction of species back into urban environments where they used to be. But we'll talk about it in a second. But it has to be in ecosystems where they obviously can function. But the broad definition of urban rewilding is bringing species back into urban environments where they could potentially thrive.
And how does one determine exactly which species might be good candidates for urban rewilding? I'm imagining things like grizzly bears wouldn't be particularly popular in a downtown city area. But what actually goes into that sort of planning process and consideration of what's going to be successful?
Sure. I mean, it's incredibly context specific. Of course, it's based on the urban environment you're working in, but it has to consider a myriad of factors, not only the ecology of the species. As you said, bringing back bears into urban environments is not sustainable, not only from a social standpoint, but probably they just don't have the home range to survive in small urban patches. So understanding the animal's ecology is one of the most important factors in terms of species selection. But you also have to talk about, and what we just touched on, the social acceptability of bringing species back into these urban environments. Obviously, the reintroduction of large apex carnivores into urban environments probably won't be seen too favorably, nor the reintroduction of species that the general public may be seen as disease carriers, or your rodent species, although they might be incredibly suitable for reintroduction into urban environments and not carrying a disease, they could be perceived as disease carrying species, and thus you see a lot of pushback from the social side of species selection. But then finally is logistic achievability, I suppose. How expensive would it be to introduce these species back into urban environments, and what logistical constraints may there be into this reintroduction? So I suppose the three tiers of species selection is your ecology, your social acceptance, and the logistics itself.
So why don't we jump into potentially an example of a species that has been reintroduced or could be reintroduced in a sort of an urban rewilding context?
Yeah, for sure. So there's been a few successful examples over the last couple of decades. In Australia, in Sydney, we've seen the reintroduction of what we call eastern pygmy possums, or antechinus, or bush rats into urban reserves in Sydney, which have seen great success. These animals have been reintroduced in an area called North Head. It's a headland north of Sydney. They were reintroduced a few years ago now, and their population is booming. And this has been coupled with invasive predator control. So, the removal of foxes and invasive cats into these ecosystems to allow these small mammals to thrive in Australia. In the UK, we've recently seen the reintroduction of beavers into London after 400 years of absence. And these beavers are doing really well on urban fringes of London. In Portugal, we've seen the reintroduction of the red squirrel into parklands there. This red squirrel hasn't been present for decades, and this is a really interesting story. The red squirrel is now doing really well in these urban parklands, and it's been coupled with this really interesting kind of social educational layer to it. Schools come out and to view these red squirrels, and there's been these big educational pushes in this reintroduction space, not only for the species benefit, but for broader educational benefit as well. And in Rio de Janeiro, and this is one of my more favorite examples, there's been a heap of work done in restoring these kind of national parks bordering these urban fringes of really popular, dense urban Rio de Janeiro. And since a few scientists have reintroduced red-rumped agouti, which is this little kind of rodent species, and brown howler monkeys. And these species are absolutely thriving in these ecosystems right next to people. So yeah, there's been some really good examples of successful urban rewilding to date.
And I'm guessing that there are some political and social challenges that are a little bit different to those that would be faced if you were doing conservation in what I think of as a more typical or traditional conservation setting, something like a large protected area. What goes into getting social buy-in and public buy-in in general for these types of projects?
Absolutely. So the social side of urban rewilding is something we need to spend, a fair bit of time discussing. To kind of take a step backwards, recently an indirect driver of biodiversity decline worldwide has been recognized as simply people's lack of connection with nature. If people are think, themselves other to nature, then they don't have this connection and thus don't preface time into conserving species or spaces. So in Sydney and in other urban environments, we've seen this increase of what we've called nature deficit disorder. People are just spending less and less time in green spaces, and this has had consequences not only to their physical health, but their mental health as well. So we need to start reconnecting people with nature. An example I like to use here, a study from a few years ago now in America showed that teenagers could readily identify corporate logos over they could native bird and plant species in their cities, common native bird and plant species. So that kind of highlights the extent of this nature deficit disorder impacting people in our cities. So urban rewilding presents us with this opportunity to start to curb this problem. If we can reintroduce species back into urban areas, colloquially people's backyards, then people will hopefully go out and start to connect more with green space, and we might be able to see a swing of nature deficit disorder more towards people, starting to go out in green spaces and connect with these species. But your question on how do we actually integrate, proper social science into these frameworks is really important. Species selection needs to be coupled with really, intensive social engagement. We need to make sure that the species we select are not only favorable to the people in cities, but also, visibility is a really important part here as well. People will connect more with the species that they can see. So, selecting really cryptic species, although they might be suitable for some of these urban reserves, from the social side of things, they mightn't have as much benefit as what would species that you might have the chance to encounter. So species visibility is a big one here. Species, general attractiveness is a good one as well. General public like, cute, cuddly species and obviously will put more effort into conserving these species. It's a known fact, slightly unfortunate fact, but it is a known fact that people will support these kind of small mammalian species. So that has to be considered in your species selection frameworks as well. But there needs to be more longitudinal studies. Of course, here we say that these efforts may improve people's conservation mindsets more broadly, but we need to show that. So any species reintroduction effort into cities needs to be coupled with really intensive social science, both before and after, to hopefully show that these efforts are actually changing people's mindsets more broadly.
Yeah, and so you take on this longitudinal work of figuring out how people are responding to it, and has any of the literature on people's mental health benefits from nature and social health benefits from nature exposure, is that literature worked its way into this sort of thinking as well? I remember reading a few articles a few years back and being really struck by how greatly people benefit from even a minor intervention that sort of exposes them to nature. Does that play a role here too?
Yeah, it does. It's kind of contextually slightly different. In urban spaces, we've seen recently this huge push of greening, green roofs, green cities, green spaces, which is super important and has shown these massive benefits, as you said, to people's mental and physical health. And that can be just as simply as looking outside of a window and seeing a plant, right? We've shown that has enough benefits to people's well-being. But this greening cities kind of push, although super successful, has resulted in these ecosystems, although they may look intact from a vegetation perspective. Studies have shown these green patches in cities are often depauperate of many native species that should be there. You get the integration of your more mobile species, your bees and bats and birds into these improved urban green spaces, but your less mobile species, like your small mammals or larger mammals or reptiles that can't get there on their own because of this highly fragmented urban settings, are largely missing from these landscapes. And this is an important point because these small species provide a heap of important ecosystem function, whether that's digging, soil turnover, scavenging, predation. So actively reintroducing these species who can't get to these improved urban green spaces on their own is a really important point to consider here. So it's the coupling of this really important push of greening cities on top of actively reintroducing species into these urban ecosystems that could naturally not get there on their own.
I'm curious, what does an active, reintroduction program look like? I mean, how many specimens do you have to release in a given place in order to create a viable population that actually, sort of does something in terms of ecosystem function? What in a really practical sense, what is that typically like?
Oh, great question. Again, it's very contextual and based on the species you're working with and the funds you're working with as well. From the examples we talk about in the paper, it's completely variable from, reintroducing 5 species all the way up to hundreds of species into these urban environments. It just depends on the species you're working with. But from the review of the literature and kind of the ingredients of success we've identified in this urban rewilding setting, the more species you can reintroduce into an urban reserve is often the better. Keeping in mind, you don't want to push over this carrying capacity of these species. You don't want to put too many in there and result in competitive disadvantage. So, introducing as many as you can is always a good thing, but that needs to be or could potentially be coupled with a number of factors that could improve the species success on the ground, whether that's the supplementation of habitat, putting artificial habitats in there, supplementary feeding, and depending on the ecosystems you're working in, coupling that with any invasive predator control is important as well. So the ingredients of success here are obviously contextual. It depends on the city you're working in, the green space you're working in, and the species you've selected, of course.
And let's just take an example, because I'm interested in the idea of scale and how much space one needs to do this sort of project. Does it have to be something that's a large urban nature preserve, or could it be something that's happening in people's literal backyards? What's sort of the general perspective on how much space you need to accomplish this type of work?
Yeah, a great question again, and again, it depends on the species of selection. I'll use an example from Perth in Western Australia. There's a species that have been recently brought back into a very small park there. It's only a few hectares in size, so not very big at all. The species is called a quenda. It's a little marsupial. If you picture kind of a small kangaroo-ish kind of animal, it's a really good digger. They were reintroduced into this park and a multi-stage reintroduction kind of process. So there wasn't all that many animals introduced into this small urban in parkland, but they're having massive benefits. A paper has recently been shown that these quenda are doing amazing work in this soil turnover and seed dispersal and even suggested that these animals may have impacts in reducing the flammability of some of these urban reserves. And we're talking, only a couple of hectares here and only a couple of animals. So a pretty substantial difference being made in a small amount of space with only a couple of guys on the ground.
And I'm curious about the potential political difficulty of carrying out projects like these. I would imagine that in a large protected area where you have a landscape that's managed by, scientists who are also conducting research there, you might have an easier time implementing something than you would in, an urban ecosystem where you have a bunch of different stakeholders and managers all kind of acting together. Is it more challenging?
I mean, sure. I don't know if more challenging is the right word here. Rather, it's just completely a different scenario. A lot of these projects we discuss have involved pretty extensive collaboration with local councils rather than local national park kind of authorities here. And just from our perspective here in the projects we're working on in Australia, local councils have been incredibly receptive to this idea and incredibly supportive in the process itself. And in turn, this enthusiasm has been kind of shown into their input into the projects. Local councils have been really fantastic to work with, and if you come to them with an idea of, we can reintroduce this species into urban reserves in your area, they're generally pretty receptive. So I would argue that no, it's no more difficult than working with national parks, for example, on a larger scale. If you find local councils or local community groups, of course, who are really keen on these projects, it's quite a rewarding process.
And, kind of thinking in that context, how long do you have to sort of pilot the idea and make the pitch and drum up support before you're able to actually introduce species?
Right. So yeah, again, it depends on the species you're working with, but it can take quite some time. You need to make sure that the actual pitch is ecologically sound. We're here for the conservation of species, so bringing these animals back into these urban ecosystems needs to be done incredibly mindfully. You need to make sure that the species your selection is you're selecting is right for the ecosystem, you have appropriate habitat, appropriate food sources, and can sustain possibly multiple generations of breeding of these populations in these urban reserves. So that needs to be a box you need to check before even going to council. I'd suggest making sure you know that the species you are selecting can actually thrive. But on top of that, as we talked about, you need to make sure that there's social support behind the project as well. And that can take time too, going to the general public, going to the community with a number of species that they may potentially see as possible urban rewilding candidates, and making sure the species we're selecting to reintroduce flies with the general public as well. So if you're considering all of these kind of boxes you need to check before you actually get species on the ground, it can take a pretty substantial amount of time. But in saying that, that amount of time is really important, because that makes sure that the project is undertaken correctly and has the highest chance of success.
And I'm wondering now about sort of the future prospects for this type of work and these types of introductions. Is the plan to sort of broaden it out, reach into smaller areas, larger areas? What kind of things are on the forefront that we should be keeping an eye out for in the future?
Oh God, it's very early days with these kind of projects, which is a really exciting space to be in, because we're starting small, and from the limited examples we've discussed here, we've started small in small urban parklands and have shown pretty good success. But it's very early on in the piece, and we have a lot to learn from these projects. And in terms of the scalability of this approach, we could start to see this approach scaled up into more larger urban parklands and urban reserves. But that comes with it the need for more intensive frameworks, not only in species selection, but in the social side of things as well. We need to make sure this is done right. And what we're lacking in this urban rewilding kind of space at the moment is a strong framework from the conception of the idea to seeing species on the ground, followed by really intensive monitoring, just to show that, what does success even look like and the highest chances of getting there. So with these frameworks, we then have the ability to scale up, as you said, to these larger urban parklands.
And, that would actually probably be a really great point to, sort of leave the conversation. But as always, you've reminded me of something and I'm interested now. So we'll ask another question. Your article included a literature review discussing the evidence base for, this concept and its application. What is the evidence base like? What have we studied so far and what do we know?
Honestly, not all that much. So the literature review was pretty much pointing towards the fact that people are just starting to discuss urban rewilding as an idea, but the actual physical examples of this approach are quite lacking. We read over 2,800 papers, and it was something like 1.2% of these papers actually showed the active reintroduction of species into urban landscapes. However, on top of this, there's been this kind of wave of momentum, or wave of enthusiasm of starting to think, wait, how can we actually get these species back onto the ground in urban ecosystems? And I think that's come off the back of some really intensive rewilding work in general. Rewilding is a term that's kind of become more and more popular, not only in the science sphere, but in the general public as well. So we've seen this kind of uptick of people thinking of how can we move this species reintroduction efforts into urban reserves.
And that strikes me as an even better note on which to finish the conversation. Thank you very much for joining me today. I appreciate your time.
Cool. Thank you very much, James.
And that concludes this episode of Bioscience Talks. Just a reminder, the journal Bioscience is published by Oxford University Press on behalf of the American Institute of Biological Sciences and is made possible by the support of our members and donors. Thank you, and talk to you next time.